24 acceptance of Turkish scripts, Latin alphabet in 1928. Now I am going to go into this, how there is both continuity and discontinuity in educational institutions. Now, as already we discussed in previous weeks, okay, now let me say it again. Now, this week I am going to discuss continuity and discontinuity between Ottoman and Republican Turkey in terms of educational institutions. So the basic references here, of course, is the reforms or revolutionary decisions, the enactment of the Turkish Parliament, the Republican Parliament in 1924, Unification of Education Law, and in 1928, again an enactment about changing the alphabet from Arabic scripts to Latin scripts or to Turkish alphabet. It is some new letters are added to Turkify the Latin alphabet. Now, let me, to start to orient you, let me show you these two laws. Let me just share, to prepare your mind, framework of your mind for the discussion of this. Now, as you know, I do this through first I go into here and share. Now let me share this, and here first let me show you Tarihi Tedrisat, Unification of Education Law. Here it is. I hope it's there. Yes, you see, it's here. And now let me show you. Now this is law number 430, and it is, this is still, the date was in 1340, March, or third month. Now, the first article says, all scientific and educational institutions in the boundaries of Turkey are now within Ministry of Education. They are transferred to Ministry of Education. Okay. Now, the second article of the law is that previously a Ministry of Waqfs and Sharia and Waqf Ministry and all other foundations, the foundation or the madrasas, the religious schools, as a matter of fact, the university for the training, the madrasa for the training of imams and hatips, they were also transferred to Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Foundation and Sharia is closed. And the third article is its budget is transferred into Ministry of Education. And now this is important. The Article 4 in the Darul Fünun, in the University of, later it becomes University of Istanbul, a faculty of theology is being opened, a faculty of theology, where the teachers for the schools, for Imam and Hatip schools will be trained. So instead of madrasas are being closed, and instead of madrasa training imams and hatips, now there is a faculty of theology, ilahiyat faculty, and there are also going to be at the lycée and junior high school and senior high school level, there will be Imam Hatip schools. This is the fourth one, and it is, it is being applied from the date it is being the law. So, this is a radical law which transforms the educational system of the Ottoman Empire up to 1924, and as I will talk in a minute, and it is a pluralistic type of educational system, and all these educational institutions are unified under the Ministry of Education. Minister of Education. That's why it is called Tevhidi Tedrisat, or Unification of Education. Now, before I go into the discussion of this, how this happened and what is this transformation in terms of social, political, structural terms, let me also show you the second law in 1928. Okay, in 1928, again, let me share my screen with you here. Let me go into that. Now, where it is, I think, no, this one. Okay, now this one, share it. Okay, now you see there, acceptance and implementation of Turkish letters, Türk harflerinin kabul ve tatbiki. Acceptance and implementation of Turkish letters, 1928. Let me show you here. You see that? Yes, you see it. Up to now, Arabic letters were used. Now, instead of them, from the letters which are taken from the Latin alphabet, but transformed into Turkish letters, is going to be used, is accepted. And the first article. Second article, from the issuing enactment of this law, all institutions of the state and of also firms, private firms, and societies, associations, they have to use Turkish letters. Now, the Arabic letters can be used in special circumstances up to 1929 in the third article that is being specified. The laws, the deeds for the land or for the houses, etc. So it is a law with 7 articles. So you have seen this as well. Let me send it. And then now let me go about to this transformation, you know. What is this educational transformation and how it should be analyzed. Now, I am going to do it, you know, in 45 minutes, an hour perhaps, depending how much more I can talk and we can stay here. But for you, I will show you now an article that I have written and published in 1991. Let me just show you where I discuss this in detail. Now I am going just very shortly, I am going to go into it. And here it is, this one, yes, and then share it. Okay, now let me show this. Okay, you see this? Yes, you do. You see, this is an article published in this book. You know, it is in English. You know, Islam in Modern Turkey, Religion, Politics and Literature in a Secular State, edited by Richard Tapper. It is a chapter of that book. And now in this, as you see, I talk about in this chapter of this chapter of that book, edited book, I talk about this Unification of Education Law of 1924, establishment of Imam Hatip schools, and before that, discussions about a Medrese reform, and I also, you see, in this article, you know, just look at this article. I combine, I combine historical sociological work. You know, I go into historical material about madrasas from 1880s up to 1924. You know, there was a discussion of how to reform madrasa system and to accommodate it to a modern nation state. Because already from 17th century, 18th century onward, there were parallel military schools, medical schools, and administrative schools parallel to madrasas. You know, so madrasas were peripheralized into only theological, ilahiyat, religious subjects. But the mudarris of these madrasas wanted to transform them and both religious subjects, religious sciences, and modern sciences of mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, you know, parallel, they should be taught in them, you see. I use that. And then I go into innovative schools and I interview them. I administer questionnaires, second source. Third source, I use educational statistics of Minister of Education, and I calculate for all provinces number of students in 1970-71 academic year, number of Imam Hatip students per 1,000 population in each province. For example, let me send this article and let me come. Now here, okay, the result of this analysis, as a result of this analysis, I have Imam Hatip schooling rates. Now, Imam Hatip schooling rates are high, for example, in 1970, I am talking about, in the following provinces: Aydın, Bolu, Isparta, Burdur, Uşak, Kayseri, Çorum, Konya, Amasya, Adana, Deniz, etc. But low in Hakkari, Bingöl, Artvin, Ağrı, these are eastern provinces, but all Mardin, okay, eastern, but also İzmir, Istanbul, İzmir, İstanbul, Zonguldak, also Mersin, İçel. You see, now the first group are those Central Anatolian, Aegean cities in the where the population wanted their children as a parallel to secular lycées, secondary schools, innovative schools were transformed to a parallel channel of education. But in less urbanized provinces like Hakkari, Bingöl, Artvin, Ağrı, there were continuing previous Medrese education, in some of them in Kurdish. But it was also a law in Izmir and Istanbul, or Zonguldak, an industrialized, urbanized province, where the population of these provinces preferred science schools, Anatolian lycées, or normal or technical vocational secondary schools, or normal secondary schools. You know, I will not go into the details of this. I am just talking about the sources, and then I go into journals, Islamic journals, and other kind of periodicals, and you know, what do they talk about religious education? But you know, I combine all these sources. Let me send this away. Now, let me talk about the situation, the historical, sociological situation. Okay, now, in previous weeks, we talked how Ottoman Empire was peripheralized, and finally, from the middle of 19th century, how Ottoman Empire tried to accommodate the changes that came as a result of integration into the world capitalist system. You see, we have compared with China, with India, with Japan. You know, all of these either voluntarily, as in the Turkish case, half voluntary, half forced. But in Japanese case, you know, the American Marines, the sea forces, marine forces were in front of Japan's capital and forcing Japan to open its doors, you know, and to be incorporated into the world capital system. Or China, again, opium wars, or India was directly colonized. Now, in the case of Ottoman Empire, it was, you know, we discussed all these, you know, accommodation. Now, in the process of this accommodation, the old Medrese system started not giving educated personnel to the reformed state and reformed military system. As you know, in 1826, Janissaries are eliminated, and a new army, more rational, modernized army is being established, and schools for the army, for the education of army personnel, and medical schools and administration schools. You know, these are Western type of secular schools, and there is also medreses, you know, all 19th century. When we came to 20th century, but towards the end of 19th century, as I said, the mudarris of the medreses, the professors of medreses were discussing to reform it, you know, and there were reform proposals, and as a result of all these discussions, a new a university level Medrese was opened to train the imams and Hatips. Actually, the name, there was a name given to it, and about how they will be trying, but what will be programmed, the curriculum of this new ministry. And again, you will remember that sociologists were discussing what kind of educational institutions should be established. Remember, again, I devoted 1 week to discussions between Ziya Gökalp, Prince Bahattin, and Satı el-Husri. Remember those, how Ziya Gökalp was proposing a centralized educational system, whereas Satı el-Husri was, and also Prince Bahattin, a more individualistic and decentralized system were being proposed. There were all those discussions and transformations, and then and after the Republic, actually, or even during the War of Independence, in 1921, there was some law about an educational law from 1920 up to 1924. The question was, what should we do about the medreses? Are these reforms enough, or should they be closed and new schools opened? And finally, as I showed you in the law of unification of education, they are being closed and transferred to Minister of Education, and a faculty is opened in the Darül Fünun in Istanbul University, and Imam Hatip schools at the secondary level. Now, what happened to them? There were some students up to 1930, from 1924 to 1933, there were some students in the Imam Hatip schools and in the Faculty of Theology. But in 1933, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his friends decided to reform the university as well. Darül Fünun is closed, and a university, Istanbul University, is being opened. And in the meantime, the Faculty of Ilahiyat, Theology, is being closed. And there were very few students in Imam Hatip schools, and hence they were also closed. So from 1933 to 1949, there were no Faculty of Theology, Ilahiyat, and no schools for training religious leaders, imams, and hatips, those who are going to give sermons in the mosques. But towards the end of single-party system of Republican People's Party in 1949, they started opening some Imam Hatip schools and an Ilahiyat faculty in Ankara University, not in Istanbul University, but in Ankara University. And then, as you know, and as we will discuss in the second semester, in 1950 elections, Republican People's Party was removed from power, and Democratic Party came into power. And starting from 1951-52, Imam Hatip schools are reopened, and village institutes are closed, and they are transformed into teachers training institutes. We will discuss about village institutes too again in the next semester. Now in this last week, I will not go into that. You know, it deserves a separate treatment actually. Throughout the years, there was ups and downs of Imam Hatip schools. You know, this religious education, secular education debate continued to the present day. You know, from a sociological point of view, and it is an interesting research area. It's an interesting research area, and I showed my research, or one product of my research, and I shared it with you. And I did other similar research with my students, with my colleagues, and other people are also doing research. It's interesting. And now, very shortly, let me give you the present situation. You know, the number of schools, what was it and what happened today. And then I will go into another research, and I will finish with that research. Now, there were in 1923-24, there were around 5,000 schools. Now there are 67,000 schools in 1920. 67,000 schools. So from 5,000 to 67,000. Now in 1923-24, there were 360,000 students in schools, you know, and now they increased to 16 million students, 16 million in 2020. Now 9 million of them are males, and 8.5 million of them are female students. Now in 1923 again, there were something like 12,000 teachers. 12,000 teachers. Now there are 1,100,000 teachers. Now in 1924, there were 479 medreses, you know, or Imam Hatip schools at that time. And now there are 673 Imam Hatip schools in 2020-2021 academic year. So this is, you know, in the transformation. Now, for example, if we look at the students in the secondary school at the lycée level, 4-year secondary school, senior high school, there are around 6 million students. 4 million of them is in the general high schools, and in 1,700,000 of them are in occupational and technical schools, and 666,000 of them are in the Imam Hatip school. You know, I can go into the details, but I don't want to go. Now, I put here material from Zürcher, from Feruz Ahmed. You know, you can go into them, you know, in detail, what was this transformation. But now I will go into a research of girls' education, women's educational history. Now I am going to talk about a PhD thesis and a book of Elifekin Akşit. Now Elifekin Akşit is my daughter as well. She is also interested in education, and she wrote this thesis, Girls' Education, the Paradoxes of Modernity and Nationalism in the Late Ottoman Empire and Early Turkish Republic. You see, my article was about the religious education in late Ottoman Empire and Turkish Republic. Now her research is on girls' education. And then she wrote a book out of this thesis. Now I am showing you this book. Kızların Sessizliği, The Silence of the Girls, a long history of girls institutes, a long history of girls institutes from 1865 to she brings it up to 1935 or something, you know. So from 19th century to 20th century, like in my article, the breaks and continuities. Now, the first one, so there are two types of schools she concentrates. One is girls' industrial schools, which are established in 1865. And then its continuation, or first break and then continuation, girls' institutes, Kız Enstitüleri, in 1920, opened in 1929. So first she goes into girls' industrial schools, and how. Now, she, in her research, she also combines different sources. In the thesis, as well as in the book, she starts with 17th, 18th century fashion, you know, new type of dressing. You know, you remember from the films, you know, Ottoman ladies in Istanbul with feraces, taking horse-driven carts and taking a stroll, walking together with their friends and chatting, you know, and their dresses this way and that way. And she goes into the regulation, how a kind of, you know, if you can think of the Foucauldian type of disciplining the dress regulation or behavioral regulation, you know, that started really in 18th century, continued into 19th century, and then it went. So the first researches documents about these regulations, you know, historical material. And then opening of girls' industrial schools, and again laws about it, decisions, historical documents, and statistics about this. And then her third source is Girls' Institutes in 1929, Kız Enstitüleri, and again documents about it, etc. And then she, in her last chapter, she interviewed the survivors of these girls, in the early girls trained in these girls' institutes. You know, Cumhuriyet Kızları, she calls them Republican girls. So she had long interviews with them, and actually, you know, she filmed them, a kind of doing historical research, historical fieldwork, kind of, and she combined them all in her thesis and in her book. Now, in this, the third chapter of her thesis is girls' education and emergence of girls' industrial schools. Now, here she goes into how traditional education that was already being practiced in the households, you know, mothers, grandmothers teach their daughters, you know, in all the households, in all Ottoman households, Muslim, non-Muslim, you know. But there was also a special educational institution within the harem, within the palace, and you know, there's a research on the palace and women's education. Leslie Pierce, so she goes into Leslie Pierce research, how concubines and other women in the palace were trained, were educated by the senior woman. In Turkish, she calls that the seniority in traditional education, ekberiyet, she calls it, and how older women, experienced women, teach the novice, the new younger woman, to do kitchen work, to do cleaning, to do embroidery, to do all kinds of things, you know. So it was an institution. It was a kind of semi-public institution, you know, the palace educational institution. There's, of course, you know, as you know, Endurun, you know, there is an educational institution for the training of the statesmen, you know, within the palace. You know, we are not talking about that one now. We are talking about girls' education. Now, in 1865, the household type of education from seniors to the juniors, and the palace type of education, and the modern educational institutions for the boys in the secondary school level and also in the professional level, in the medical school, in the military school, in the administrative schools, you know, taking examples from them, combining the traditional methods of seniority, juniority with the new contemporary modern methods. So actually she criticizes this dichotomy of modern and traditional, how traditional and modern make up a hybrid institution, hybridization as a matter of fact. So she says similarities concerning the coursework and the same-sex character of girls' education suggest continuities between household education and education provided in girls' education, girls' industrial education. You know, this is a quote. I took a quote from Bahattin Akşit's thesis on girls' education. And then she goes into these, again, this quotation, these raise questions as to the validity of accepted answers that were asserted by modernization theory. So she's criticizing modernization theory and modernization theory's dichotomy, duality of tradition and modernity. So again, a quote here. In other words, understanding these continuities challenges the dichotomous definitions of modern and traditional. Okay, now this is now she also goes into before establishment of girls' industrial schools, there were girls' rushdiyas, high schools for girls, girls' rushdiyas. So she's comparing these rushdiyas, girls' rushdiyas, with girls' industrial schools. You see, these girls' Rushdiyas were at general education, literacy. But girls' industrial schools were for, some common courses with girls' Rushdiyas or high schools for girls. But here there was, this was a technical occupational school for women, especially Muslim women, to work in the industrial establishments, or for girls to produce materials, dressing material, clothing materials for the army, and other types of materials. You see, there were already non-Muslim women working in these sectors, but with these girls' industrial schools, there were also Muslim women, women from Muslim families, or orphan girls, mostly orphan girls, being educated in these schools, in these industrial schools. She goes into how Mithat Pasha first opened this girls' industrial schools in Rusçuk, and how there were parallels between boys' industrial schools, and girls' industrial schools, similarities, the differences. It is really an interesting research into history of education of women, and as I read, she elaborates about this ekleriyet type of education, seniority education, and she gives, as I said, reference to Leslie Pierce, who did a research in harem, in the palace, on palace. She has a book on the palace, the woman in the palace, and Isambike Togan, who did a similar research on this seniority type training in Turkic states in Central Asia, in Central Asia. And then she goes into the products of these schools. For example, she talks about Halide Edip Aduvar. Halide Edip Aduvar is trained in private schools. Now, for example, she's trained in the American college. But there are others who are trained. You see, there were so many private schools. Now, let me share this table with you. What was the situation for girls' education, public education, and private education. She has two tables in her thesis. Let me try to show it if I can, as I do usually. Again, let me go here and let me share my screen, kind of. Let me go here, and now, okay, this one here. Let me share it. Okay, do you see this table? Yes, let me make it a little bit larger by putting this here like this. You see, she shows from 1883 to 1914, just before the war. Now, in 1883, in girls' Rushdiyas, there were 10 schools, girls' Rushdiyas, public schools. And every year, 418 girls were enrolled in these schools. in 1983 again, in girls' ibtidaiyis. You see, ibtidaiyis are elementary school, kind of. Rushdiyas are junior high school, you know. There were 8 of them, and there were 637 girls there in girls' ibtidaiyis. And then her topic, girls' industrial schools. In 1894-95 academic year, there were 12 girls' industrial schools. You know, these are state schools, public schools, 12 of them. And there were 1,537 girls being educated here. Now, again in 1894-95, there was also Islamic ibtidaiyis, Islamic elementary schools, and there were 243 of them, Islamic ibtidaiyis, and there were 5,900 something students there. And then there were mixed ibtidaiyis in 1913, in 1914. She couldn't find the number of schools, but there were 4,200 something students there. You know, this is really, you know, just a material for historical sociological analysis, and indeed she analyzes them, and then she goes into, let me see, the other. Now this one, it was the second table. Okay, this one. Now, schools outside of Istanbul in 1905. Are you there? Yes. Schools. Let me a little bit put it this way. Maybe yes. Now, schools outside of Istanbul in 1905-1908 period. In the public schools that we have seen in the first table, there were in boys public schools, there were 3,300 something boys and 334 girls schools, in boys schools and girls schools. In mixed schools, there were 3,000. Now, in the private version, private schools, not state schools, but private schools, there were all millets in Ottoman Empire, or all non-Muslim, Muslim and non-Muslim private schools. Now, there were in Muslim private schools, there were 1,400 boys and 132 girls schools, private schools, students, and 629 students in the mixed schools. These are private Muslim schools. In private Greek schools, there were 890 something in boys schools and 222 in girls schools and in the mixed one. And then Armenian, American, Jewish, Bulgarian, French, Italian. You see, there are so many schools here. Let me send this away. Okay, now you see, unification of education unified all these schools under the Minister of Education. Now, the Muslim and Turkish ones there, and the non-Muslim ones, they are not, they are open, they continued, but with the permission and supervision of Minister of Education, and the Medrese are closed, as we discussed. Now, if I continue with the girls' institutes. Let me go into from 1929 to 1940. Now, girls' industrial schools were closed, but now girls' institutes were opened in 1929. And Bahattin Akşit wanted to see now what are the continuities and discontinuities between girls' industrial schools and the girls' institutes, Kız Enstitüleri. So she found out that these institutes were located in Istanbul, Bursa, Manisa, İzmir, Ankara, Adana, Trabzon, Elazığ. There are all these. And then she goes into two girls' institutes. One is the one in Elazığ, the other in Izmir. One in Eastern Turkey, the other in Western Turkey. And on the basis of material that's provided by the memoirs and the journals published, and she finds out similarities in the curriculum of the Elazığ and of Izmir. Now, as I said, Izmir students of Izmir Girls Institute published a lot, material. So she went into all this material, she read them. And then in the case of Elazığ, the administrator of Elazığ, Sıdıka Avar, published a book about her experiences in these schools. And from her, let me just see. Okay, now Sıdıka Avar's books details really how the education was carried out. You see, in Elazığ, village girls of the region were being taken into the institute, and they were trained. Whereas in Izmir, also city girls, mostly from the city. The students were mostly from city. So one difference is village girls and city girls. The other one is the degree of modernization of the city and the village, and Western villages and Eastern villages, and the language spoken in Eastern villages, and the girls being taken into these girls' institutes. Some of the girls speak Kurdish, and in the Girls' Institute, they learn Turkish, and also, according to curriculum, all other skills. So it is sociologically really very interesting contrasts and similarities between the two institutes and their educational policies and the results of the each. She did the research, but it is actually a fertile area for research. Now, before I finish this lecture, which is already long, because before the lecture I gave you feedback about your midterm exams. Let me finish this with a translation of a poem about the students in this in these girls' institutes. So the title is "To the Turkish Girl." Now it says, "Dear Turkish girl, find your useless hopes and dispose them." Get rid of them, dispose them. "Let motherhood be the ultimate aim for you." Let the motherhood be the ultimate aim for you. "Channel your knowledge and energy to your family so that they can be healthy and smile with you. There is no end for those who go another way. This way, the most productive years of your life go away, believe me, if you go another way instead of family way. Those who cannot reach their aims are many, because everything in life goes back to its ancestry." Now, as you can see, these girls' institutes were training women for household, for women within the households, rather than for work outside. Although in some of the institutes, some of the skills they learn, like sewing, embroidery, etc., they can also find jobs in the economic, various sectors of the economy. And in case you want to work these skills, they were also being taught, but it was minor. The main focus was training for the family work, domestic work. The women are actually the domestic workers in the family, unpaid domestic workers, and these institutes were training, educating women, girls institutes, Kızların Enstitüleri, for that work. Okay, now this week I talked about discontinuity problem. This is a sociological problem that we have been discussing in order to understand social structure of Turkey. We have to understand this discontinuity from Ottoman, Young Turk era to the early Republican, and then multi-party Republican, and to the present, which we will do in the second semester. So thank you for being with me in this virtual